Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us today. As you may have heard from the initial announcement, everybody's microphone will be automatically muted throughout the webinar today, but we really encourage you to write any questions that you may have into the Q&A function, and we'll get the panel to address these in the Q&A section towards the end. So just covering some quick introductions before we get started. So I'm Richard Davis, Associate Director for Climate Strategies, South Pole UK, based here in London. Joined today by Steve Edwards, Global Director for Biodiversity, based in our office in Switzerland. Diana Swidler, based in New York, Managing Consultant for Biodiversity. I'm really pleased to be joined by our guest panelist today, Jerome Badley, who is the Director of Sustainability for Center Parcs in the United Kingdom. So just touching on our agenda for this webinar, got a lot of content to go through. Obviously, it's a big topic, a lot of interesting discussions taking place. We're going to quickly frame the issues in a short introductory segment. Steve is then going to provide a bit of an insight into the UK biodiversity markets, how we're viewing this from both a compliance and a voluntary perspective. Diana will then be highlighting the role of TNFD in the UK market, how this can play a key role for businesses in understanding how to assess the sort of risks, opportunities and strategy when it comes to nature and biodiversity. And then we'll be having a discussion with Jerome about Center Parcs, how they've been developing their business strategy and giving nature a voice within the business. And then of course we'll be coming to your questions at the end. So just diving in, I'm sure everyone is joining this webinar today with some understanding of what we're talking about and the urgency of the issues that we're addressing. But just to provide a bit of framing and some definitions of where we're talking, when we're referring to nature, we are talking about all life on Earth, along with inanimate aspects. So we are talking about elements such as geography, geology, but also water. When we start talking about biodiversity, we're really talking about everything that is living. And we're going to be talking about the kind of variations that exist within that sphere in terms of genetic, species, and an ecosystem level. And of course, there is a clear link as well into this sort of the climate crisis and the climate conversations that we're all having within our businesses. Of course, climate change is a key driver of biodiversity loss, but also the action that we can take in seeking to reverse this biodiversity loss will be a key action in helping to try and reverse some of the impacts and the pressures that are creating some of that climate change drivers. When we start thinking about the challenge and really the shape of this conversation, of course, everyone's aware that we are going through the Earth's resources at a rate that is unsustainable. We're using the equivalent of 1.6 of the planet's resources to maintain our current way of life. And it's no surprise that our ecosystems can't keep up with the pressures that we're exerting upon them. When we look at some of these sort of facts and figures being provided by UNEP, we've got about 47% of natural ecosystems have declined. On average, 25% of species that were assessed in both animal and plant are threatened. It's a huge impact in the ocean as well as on land. About 66% of the ocean area impacted by human activities. And we've had a significant decline in the relative species abundance in the last 50 years. I think it's really key to highlight this. Not only, do you see this alignment with the climate crisis, where such a large percentage of the anthropogenic carbon has been released in such a short time window, it really highlights both the urgency of the issue and the impacts humans are having. This is a human-caused crisis, and this is also something that humans in our action can reverse if we're putting our energies and our focus in the right place. Zooming in on the UK as well, it may come as no surprise to many people within the UK that we, as a relatively small island with a long history of sustained extraction and human use, we actually have one of the highest levels of nature depletion of many countries monitored in this study. We're actually looking at about 75% of UK environments show a high level of ecosystem degradation. I mean, the map on the left actually demonstrates the area where we could have temperate rainforest in the UK. According to all the right climate indicators, we actually have about 72 square miles of temperate rainforest existing currently, sort of highlighting again the state of depletion in some of those areas. We're also looking at about 55% of species threatened with decline, 16% at risk of extinction. Again, that decline has been steep, And that's despite the fact that we've had a massive increase in public spending around the biodiversity issue. Steve will come to this in just a moment in terms of some of the more recent efforts to try and address and reverse this decline. But when we look at this and taking sort of a recent snapshot of the year, sort of financial year 2019 to 20, so pre-COVID, we're still spending around 0.02% of GDP on biodiversity, essentially sort of restoration. It's worth highlighting as well that the National Institute for Economic and Social Research did highlight that the effect of biodiversity loss for the UK in the next decade could be around a 12% loss in GDP in about 10 years' time. Also worth putting that side by side with the fact that the impact of COVID was about an 11% drop in GDP. So this is a really significant issue for the UK, not just for wildlife, but also for businesses, for essentially the genuine kind of survival of the UK as we know. We're also talking about the linkage between climate change and biodiversity. And a key factor in all of this is, of course, land use. How are we using the land that is there, that is previously being the ecosystem, the environment for nature, is being given over to extraction and for use by companies and primarily for people. And there's a key consideration here about how this sort of highlights as well the kinds of actions that we can be taking as a company and as businesses in the UK. There's an urgent need to invest in biodiversity conservation, restoration, and sustainable management. It is going to be about looking to fill the finance gap that is there. We know that we need about 330 billion to 824 billion. I think Steve will probably tell us what we're up to in the current number at the moment, but we're not quite there yet. But this is also about the kind of actions that companies can be taking right now within their own supply chains, within their own natural capital, how to improve better management, sustainable practices, and start taking action right away. So that's just a bit of the scene setting, and now we're going to hand over to Steve to talk a bit more about the UK biodiversity markets from a compliance and voluntary perspective. Steve.
Thanks very much, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone. For those of you that may have not been giving your full attention to either elections or football over the past days and weeks, will have noticed that there's been some important progress in terms of regulatory contexts. The Australians a few months ago have passed a nature repair market bill. In England, the biodiversity net gain approach has come into force within the past several months. And then just very recently, the EU has passed a nature restoration law. All of these are indicators that the regulatory contexts in terms of using mechanisms to generate funding from the private sector to help pay for some of that financing gap that Richard mentioned in his comments is real and alive and coming along now. Next slide, please. So Richard pointed out that there actually is quite a gap in terms of what is projected as a need for bending the curve, so to speak, of the loss of nature. We're still quite far from that. We do know that these are recent numbers coming out of the United Nations Environment Program. We do know that there is a little over $200 billion flowing towards conserving nature at a global level. Most of which is coming from the public sector, arguably as it should, but there is an important portion and probably a growing portion that is coming from the private sector, and those are the little blobs down there in the bottom, whereas the green ones up towards the top are coming from public finance and all of the governmental investments into nature. What I'll be talking about are biodiversity markets specifically, and that is how we are setting up regulatory mechanisms for the public sector to use the marketplace to either address their negative impacts upon nature or make nature positive contributions, an issue that Deanna will talk about a little bit more in her remarks. Next slide, please. So the amount of opportunity that is here in terms of these biodiversity credits coming out of a biodiversity marketplace at a global level are actually potentially quite substantial. even with very little effort by governments and other entities to try and grow it. There is still an expectation that this marketplace will involve $1 billion within the next 6 or 7 years. To put that into context, the voluntary carbon market, not last year, but the year before that, was approaching $2 billion. And the aspirations, once we get out in towards 2050, if there is a lot of effort put into this, are really quite substantial in terms of what can be done. So it's no surprise that there is a lot of attention being paid to this by governments around the globe, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Next slide, please. So all of this is fitting into the context of how global governments are acknowledging, as Richard pointed out earlier, the crisis of biodiversity loss and the impacts that that has on nature, of course, and also importantly upon us as humans. And we'll learn more about how these biodiversity credits, which are part of a potential marketplace or a real one, can play a part in a corporate nature positive journey. We also know that they can be used as part of the contributions to the global goals that were set out and agreed upon in the Global Biodiversity Framework under the Convention of Biological Diversity, that the more recent COP that was signed in 2 years ago in Montreal in Canada. And also that there is some interplay between the use of these mechanisms, both to offset negative impacts and or make nature positive impacts. Next slide, please. There are a number of drivers, demand drivers behind the use of these biodiversity credits. We can envision a company that is sourcing their products from a certain region, may want to protect watersheds, for example, around where they are getting their coffee from, or they may want to protect other ecosystem services and their supply chains to ensure that they have access to freshwater resources to be able to navigate rivers. This was a problem here in Europe last year with the recent drought, that products were not able to move up and down some of the major tributaries to deliver products to market. There may be interest in using nature positive approaches or, importantly, restoring nature, as we saw from the EU Nature Restoration Law, or the possibilities in Australia, excuse me. And also, finally, we're pretty familiar with the carbon market now. There are ways to enhance the value of nature-based solutions that are used in carbon. Next slide, please. So the UK is actually in the forefront of this effort of applying the compliance markets for biodiversity, and you should probably all be familiar with BNG, or biodiversity net gain. It's an approach being applied in England so far, and it is an attempt to ensure that natural habitats are left in an even better state than they were before the development takes place. So this is mandatory. It is the law. Currently, it applies to major developments. Usually those are properties or property developments. Increasingly now, small sites have been added to that, and larger infrastructure projects are going to be coming online in the relatively near future. And the primary goal behind this then is to find ways for the private sector to not only reduce their negative impacts upon nature, but also then to contribute to the England and the UK more broadly, enhancing their overall level of nature throughout the country. I won't go deep into the details, but it's important to understand that in this case of the BNG approach, it is measured quite rigorously using a tool that the government has set out that calculates biodiversity units based upon the ecosystem and habitat that is affected. And that above and beyond those negative impacts, then a project developer needs to meet the level of units that are being negatively impacted and add another 10% on top of them, hence the net gain. All of this is then tracked in a registry, verified by local planning authorities, and it's also really important, that this is being closely watched by many governments around the world. Next and last slide, please. So why is this also relevant for our discussions today? Because there is also an interplay between the existence of these compliance markets and the arrival of biodiversity credit schemes or voluntary biodiversity markets. We're already seeing that in the UK context, where habitat banks that are being set up to offer compliance units are also exploring the marketplace to see who might be interested in buying those units or credits from them in a voluntary capacity. And so that's really a signal that this is a market that is ready to take off, that there are a lot of opportunities here, but we also have some necessity to learn more. I'll stop there for now and I'll pass over to my colleague, Diana. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to speak how the TNFD can help companies in the UK market. Please, next slide. So to understand the role of TNFD, we have to see how it can help companies, and it helps with two purposes. One, it helps to report under voluntary and statutory reports for markets and regulators. And the other one is that provides a framework to identify impacts and dependencies that companies may have in relationship with nature and how to translate them into risks and opportunities that can be material for the future of the company. So basically, it is helping companies to take better informed decisions for impacts that they are occurring now in their operations and across value chains, and it can become risks in the future. Please, next slide. So here, this is a pretty good slide to understand how the TNFD fits in the emerging reporting architecture that we are seeing how it's evolving in the nature space. So the first row, we can see the internal policy goals, the international policy goals for climate action under the Paris Agreement, but also for the nature space under the Global Biodiversity Framework. Under that line, we have another row that says international frameworks. So here, probably you are familiar with science-based targets and TCFD, which are international frameworks that are helping to internalize the overarching goal under the Paris Agreement into the corporate action and financial institutions. So if you see, we have similar international frameworks in the nature space. We have the TNFD and we also have the SBT for nature that also helps companies to internalize those targets under the Global Biodiversity Framework and ultimately the overarching goal of halting biodiversity loss by 2030 and getting positive recovery by 2050. Then we can see that we also have the corporate reporting standards. We have CDP, GRI, IFRS with ISSB and SAP. So all that, all these corporate reporting standards are probably very familiar to you. And if you are already reporting under any of them, you have probably realized that there is a major shift in all the questionnaires, trying to include those questions where the companies have the opportunity to increase transparency about their relationship with nature. So all these players at international policy level and then at corporate level with international frameworks and corporate reporting standards, they are cooperating together and they are interacting and influencing each other. And this is what we are also seeing in the market regulation. So here we are seeing how in different countries they are taking and they are interacting with these different organizations. And the perfect example that everybody may be familiar with is the European Union and the CCRD with the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. So here we can see a very good example of alignment between all these organizations where if you report under the TNFD, you will be complying with the ESRS in the European Union. So it is very early to say because the sustainable disclosure requirements from the UK government are not finalized yet. They are going to be released next year, but we can also see that alignment with these different players. Like we can see the alignment with the ISSB, and also the UK government has welcomed the TNFD work and also is monitoring closely the UK TNFD Consultation National Group. Please go next. So TNFD helps companies to manage nature-related risks. And why? Because we cannot consider risk as a matter of philanthropy anymore, because it is considered by investors and regulators as a systemic risk. And companies have to start showing that they can manage these new risks in relationship with nature. So we can see here a couple of news that I have gathered from the last couple of months. The most recent one comes from the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is an organization of 115 central banks across the globe. Bank of England is a permanent member of this organization, and in this month they released a report called the Nature-Related Litigation, where they state that nature-related litigation cases will keep increasing. We also have a report from the Commonwealth Climate for Law Initiative, which is a think tank of international experts that released a report earlier this year where they are stating that UK directors may be exposed to liability if they don't handle appropriately nature-related risks within their companies. Also, on the investor side, there is this other news that I'm highlighting here from VMP AM, which is an asset manager. So as an asset manager, they have to manage mutual funds, and they also have proxy voting from its shareholders. And its voting policy has become stricter, taking into consideration ESG indicators that now also has included biodiversity-related expectations. Please go next. So here in this slide, we are trying to represent how TNFD can help companies to manage these new related risks. So we have transitional risks as an example, the ones that they have just said in the previous slide, but we also have physical risks that can be managed through the TNFD framework. Like, for instance, one of the most common ones could be the disruption of the supply chains because there is a lack of a specific raw material. But also they are including systemic risks. This is a very interesting point from TNFD, because these systemic risks go beyond companies' borders. Here they are considering ecosystem stability risk and also financial stability risks. So all these risks are identified and assessed through the TNFD, and those that are more material for the company, they are included in the risk management system. Why? Because this is a good way to understand new strategic planning for the company. So through the strategic planning, companies can quantify financially those risks and also opportunities that can materialize and can pose a financial impact for the company's operations. This is the TNFD also helps to report, as I said before, because increased transparency across the supply chains, manage risks, and also meet investors' demand. Please go next. So here we are going to speak a little about some case studies where South Pole has supported a couple of companies. Please go next. Okay, so let's go first to the retail sector. So here South Pole helped Ocado Retail to understand what kind of physical risk was coming from biodiversity loss in two priority locations. UK was one of the priority locations, and the other one was Southern Europe. And with this kind of assessment, Ocado understood better and gained better understanding of the biodiversity outcomes with different climate scenario parameters, and also help Ocado to prioritize actions for biodiversity loss. Go next, please. Let's now go to the energy sector with Celsia, which is an energy producer and distributor. So Celsia is a TNFD early adopter, and what that means is that Celsia has already committed to report under the TNFD recommendations as early as this year, 2024. So we gave them support with implementation of the whole TNFD guidance. we identify and assess impacts and dependencies and risks and opportunities related to nature into their direct operations and value chains. Here we are speaking also about upstream activities and downstream activities. And we help them to include the most material risks and opportunities within its risk management system, which has helped Celsia to become more robust in its strategy, and also to align its corporate biodiversity goals with national and international policy targets. Please go next. So this is a hypothetical case that we have not come across yet, but I would love to work on one of these. But imagine that you are a project developer that you want to develop a commercial facility in England. So how TNFD will work for you? So first of all, TNFD will help you to assessment of different plots of land for development based on its biodiversity importance and the influence and application of the biodiversity net gain regulation depending on the plot. Also, TNFD will help you to assess financial impact between different alternatives that the regulation offers you, like compensate with on-site units, with off-site units, or even buying statutory credits. But also TNFD will help you with report compliance across borders. So imagine that you are also operating in the European Union, so TNFD will help you with that reporting. And we offer, finally, a standardized language that will be easier for investors and asset managers to understand and to know better how you are managing nature-related risks. Please go next. Just to finalize, I would like to speak a little about who is disclosing with TNFD. So we have already 58 companies in the UK that it has committed to report under the TNFD recommendations. This means that they are ready to report in this year, 2024 or 2025. And globally, we have more than 400 companies that have committed the same. But if you are still thinking about reporting under the TNFD, you don't have to commit this year or next year to report. You can still engage with TNFD in different ways. Please go next. One of the best ways to engage with the TNFD is through the TNFD forum. Here there are 1,500 members from 89 sectors and 69 countries represented, contributing to the development of the TNFD framework. South Pole is one of the consulting firms that is actively participating in the TNFD forum and in several national consultation groups. So one of the most active is, in fact, Colombia, the Colombia TNFD National Consultation Group, and that makes sense because COP16 is happening there late October this year. And one of the activities that we are doing in that consultation group is providing feedback from TNFD early adopters about lessons learned and challenges of implementing the TNFD. And this feedback is being handed over by the National Association of Colombian Companies to the Colombian government, who has an open consultation with different stakeholders to understand how they can articulate the global biodiversity framework goals into the National Biodiversity Action Plan. So just as a key takeaways, just to finalize and hand it over to Jerome, I want you to leave with 5 key takeaways. 1, nature and biodiversity are corporate risks alongside climate change. The biodiversity net gain is a world-class policy. We cannot lose sight of it. Basically, it is doing the job of channeling private investments into conservation and restoration of nature. There is a trend of these emerging regulations that are driving companies to develop strategies to work in harmony with nature, and TNFD is one of those frameworks that can help companies to develop these strategies. Compliance biodiversity markets provide an important signal for actors operating in the voluntary market. And then finally, forward-thinking businesses are harnessing the links between biodiversity and climate by embedding the value of nature within their value chains. Thank you, and now I'm going to pass it over to Jerome.
Thanks very much, Diana. And thanks very much, Steve. Some really, really interesting presentations. I think in terms of starting to think about those kind of key considerations for businesses in the UK, whether you're kind of understanding the contribution you can be making or the contribution you're going to have to be making under the compliance and voluntary schemes, and also thinking about your responsibility as a business to understand your risks, both to the environment, but also what kind of nature-based risks exist within your business and disclose them. There's a lot to be thinking about at the moment. Also really keen to ensure that we're kind of talking about maybe some companies that maybe don't quite fit into both of those categories right now. Of course, you've seen that list of those early adopters on TNFD. It's great to see so many very large companies in there, but we know that not everyone has got the capability to get stuck into TNFD right now. But at the same time, we've got a real urgency to make sure that businesses are doing all they can to be giving nature more of a voice within the company and setting a clear strategy for how can businesses take action, not just in the long term, but also as soon as possible, but really doing that in the right way in the right places. So I'm incredibly pleased to be joined by Jerome Bagley from Center Parcs. Jerome has about, almost 25 years of experience of leading and delivering on sustainability. Currently in his role as Director of Sustainability for Center Parcs UK and Ireland, Jerome's leading the team responsible for improving Center Parcs' environmental impacts and providing careful custodianship for its forests. Previously, before Center Parcs, Jerome was also leading our sustainability for the NHS in England and as a senior advisor in sustainable healthcare to the Aga Khan Development Network. And among his many awards, worth highlighting that in 2019, Jerome was recognised as Environmentalist of the Year by Society of the Environment. So really pleased to have so much experience and knowledge joining us today to discuss a bit more about Center Parcs and how Jerome and the business have helped shape the strategy within the business. So first of all, thanks very much for joining us, Jerome. Welcome.
Thanks for the big sell there, Richard. I've got to live up to that now, haven't I?
No pressure.
No pressure.
Brilliant.
Well,
So,
yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's been really, really interesting to listen to the first two speakers and those different perspectives. I have to say, hopefully I can give a bit of a flavour of what this looks like practically for a business that's buried in the biodiversity challenge.
absolutely. And so just as kind of a start for 10, can you give us a quick sort of short overview of Center Parcs, the business, whether we might have some people who aren't UK based? I'm sure everyone in the UK will be pretty familiar with your business, especially if they have kids or have been kids. And of course, the role of nature, how it's important to the brand and your considerations, both in terms of your nature on site and in your supply chain.
Thanks for that. So, yeah, Center Parcs is a hospitality sector business. So, an operator of 6 very large holiday parks in the UK. There is a European brand as well, which spans across Europe. Different business, same brand, same name, but Center Parcs UK and Ireland has been operating for 35 years, starting out of Sherwood Forest, my neighbourhood sort of forest, close to Nottingham. But we are a private equity owned business valued up to about 5 billion, owned by Brookfield currently. So as a business, we welcome over 2 million guests a year to our 6 forests across the UK and Ireland. We have one forest in the European Union in Southern Ireland, and we have about 10,000, just over 10,000 staff. And our forests are typically around 160 hectares each, so they're pretty large. 70% of them are undeveloped forest, and we're a landowner or a manager for all of those. But we've basically planted 900 lodges, a large swimming pool, a lot of restaurants within what were originally commercial woodlands, and then invested an awful lot of time and energy in turning those commercial woodlands into more biodiverse, rich, and healthy forests over the years. But we're also a major restaurateur, so we're one of the largest restaurateurs in the UK, certainly in the top 10 for covers. By some accounts, maybe in the top 5 for the number of covers that pass through our restaurants. And without our forests, we're not really a business. Natural capital is immensely important to us. Without the forests and the forest environment within which our lodges and all of our infrastructure is nestled, we don't really have a business. So yeah, that natural capital, the forest and the wildlife within them are amazingly important to us. And we've always, instinctively as a business worked in partnership with nature on that basis.
Fantastic. And so I guess picking up on that point, so as you say, there's a huge role for the natural capital in the business, a huge sort of impact across the supply chain as well. And as you said, this has really been kind of rooted in the Center Parcs business right from the very beginning. In terms of turning these kind of elements, there are risks in your supply chain, you have the responsibility and the risks in terms of what's within your sphere of operations directly under your control. How have you gone about setting a target and developing sort of a strategy as a business and codifying that? And have there been sort of specific frameworks that have played a role or that you're working to in the future? Have you used these?
Yes, we have the blessing or the curse of a foot in both the EU and the UK, and having a huge sort of scale as a business in terms of responsibility around climate change and around biodiversity. So we're hit from every side by all of the four-letter acronyms. So all of the European ones and the UK ones as they're coming down the line. I think there's an awful lot of stuff that we've done, as I say, instinctively as a business, because this is so core to our USP around. I mean, from the very beginning, we've had conservation rangers embedded into our forests, working on tracking and targeting ways in which we can improve and enhance ecology. And of course, so we've always had to report under the carbon reporting and the SECA and the energy and sustainability reporting requirements that sit within the UK government's rules. I'd say of late, the arrival of things like the CSRD and the TCFD and now things like the EU taxonomy as well. Yeah, they've certainly helped provide a little bit of impetus to formalise what was already there as a very strong management, governance, and sort of structural approach. And over the last couple of years, we've certainly looked at what we do and thought, actually, well, goodness, that's quite reassuring that we know we're doing the right things, but now we just have to be a little bit more overt about saying that we do the right things and interpreting it in the language and the frameworks that are being presented to us, which does create a huge amount of work. Anybody who is suffering with the CSRD at the moment will know what I mean. The whole double materiality assessment business. But actually, it really does help sort of elevate the priority of this at a board level. Not that it didn't have a priority, but in terms of the structural and systematic approach to codifying what we do into sort of numbers and lines and formal statements. I'd say the one thing that's had the biggest impact, or sorry, not the biggest impact, but it's been the most useful around biodiversity so far has been the biodiversity net gain piece. I think, as the CSRD framework is basically saying that this is basic sustainability reporting that everybody should be doing. We all should be doing anyway. But the biodiversity net gain piece actually added something new in that we'd never really before been able to quantify with a government-backed methodology a number that allowed us to say this is the quality of our biodiversity. This is the quality of our. It's not perfect, but it's a way of quantifying the quality of the ecosystems, not all the species necessarily, but the ecosystems that we're custodians of. And that's been really, really quite eye-opening because it's allowed us to tell us to develop the narrative for ourselves, at least, that was something we already knew, but actually we started with fairly sterile commercial forests, and we've made them better. But now we can actually do that with numbers, and we can show that that's a real progression. So we've taken that tool and applied it to our forests wholesale, rather than just going, we want to develop that bit, let's assess that bit, and then work out how we replace it with 110% of something else. We've applied that methodology to our entire estate and said, actually, that's the biodiversity quality of our estate, and these are the places where we can possibly work to improve it over time. So we've applied it and linked it into our established forestry management plans as a way of guiding and helping to steer and quantify progress. Measurable progress in biodiversity is gold dust, really, really important. So it's been quite a useful tool for us, and it will continue to be a useful tool. We're not sharing externally those numbers yet, but we're certainly doing it in a shadow form within our business, and it's helping that discourse with our board.
That's brilliant, and a really, really interesting point. I think it's actually something we were discussing when we were at the conference for TCFD and risk. That's quite a while ago now. But I think it's a really valuable point about that quantification of natural capital, and also about having kind of a shared framework that businesses can start to use as well. Yeah. Of course, as anyone who's been previously engaging in voluntary biodiversity credits or any other aspect of sort of quantifying biodiversity, it is challenging. How do you compare forest to grassland, mangroves to peatland? It's not as simple as what we're talking about when we're dealing with carbon. So these kind of shared frameworks, sort of languages and calculating tools, I think will really help to drive that process forward. When we're also starting to think about that sort of quantification element, I'm aware you've obviously highlighted as a business, you haven't yet begun on TNFD, and of course CSRD is a looming piece of compliance. And just taking a moment to quickly plug South Pole's double materiality assessment and CSRD gap analysis services, do get in touch. When you're kind of thinking about that compliance wave, but also starting to think about risk, as a business at the moment, how are you sort of considering these elements of risk, highlighting those, potentially quantifying them at the moment? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is risk-based, isn't it? I mean, the materiality approach that we're doing in-house, but it's not for the faint-hearted. And the TCFD has been very helpful in identifying the areas of risk that we need to manage. But for us, of course, a lot of those areas of risk do intersect with nature and biodiversity because it's such a major part of our business. So I think it has been helpful, sort of aligning this with risk and potential benefit, because if we don't get managing biodiversity right, people are becoming more and more discerning about the impacts businesses have on biodiversity, as they have done over the years with climate change. And I think biodiversity is following on from that awakening around the impacts of climate change, but it's not very far behind. And I think climate change has already carved a path that biodiversity is accelerating up, even faster behind. So, there's a huge amount to do there. But I think, I mean, in terms of just to roll back a little bit around the credits piece. I mean, we're not looking at biodiversity net gain as a way to assess where we might want to buy credits. And to be honest, the whole issue of offsetting and credits is not really the place where any business should be starting. I don't think a business should be starting about how can I reduce as far as possible first, and then look at opportunities to inset if at worst. And we certainly wouldn't be looking to go outside and buy credits, because there's a whole load of issues around public credibility around external credits markets. I'm not saying it's not always the solution. I think it's often the last port of call. But for us as a business, looking at how we use things like biodiversity net gain and these risk frameworks to identify ways we can operate better as a business within our own boundaries before even thinking about external markets or credits and the like is where we're at. And if we don't do it properly, our guests will respond. People expect this of us, and actually, we put ourselves out there as a business that takes this to heart, and we genuinely do. And we certainly don't want to do anything to create a dissonance in that. So, and that's really key. Actually, when the board takes this on board, which they have, our ESG steerco is chaired by our chief exec. Things start to move. And in terms of actually having this as a voice for nature throughout our business, which is actually where we are, it's always been there, as I say. But now the impetus of these frameworks has allowed us to say, actually, no, we're really going to make that point. We do have and give a voice to nature in everything we do. And today is a great day to be saying this because we've just launched our annual report this morning. I reposted it on LinkedIn, and we've made nature a key stakeholder in our business. So nature is now a stakeholder in our business alongside our guests, alongside our shareholders, alongside our staff. We've actually stated that nature is a stakeholder in our business, and we will listen to the voice of nature from our villages all the way up to our board, through advocates, of course, but actually, it's a key moment. I'm very proud of that for Centre Parks. I think it's a really important thing, and it's not something that other businesses, should be shy of doing.
Absolutely. And congratulations, it's a fantastic achievement. I'm looking forward to reading the report in full. And just kind of sticking with that point at the moment, I think it's a really, really interesting one. And I think something that'll be of keen interest to our audience as well. I think a couple of things you've highlighted there are really important. Of course, as you said, you've got a lot of natural capital on site. Of course, a lot of our clients also work in agricultural value chains. They may have direct impact on the environment, but also, as you highlighted, opportunities for insetting within their value chains with their partners. Some really key initiatives. Before then, they consider, how do they take accountability and responsibility off-site? How do they contribute to the wider loss that they may not have that direct impact on? But I think there's a really key sort of thing to come back to there. That idea of kind of giving a voice to nature within the business. Obviously, we've seen companies take a leadership position on climate change. And if they haven't, they will be kind of getting more and more impetus from mandatory climate risk disclosures and reporting. So when we start thinking about nature, as you said, this is still a bit more nascent at the moment, but it's hugely important, hugely impactful, and it can be something that turns into a real driver and point of difference for companies. Outside of responsibility, this can be a key way to differentiate and communicate with customers and show how much the business values our nature and biodiversity in the market. Now, one kind of question I have, and to bring that back round, what advice would you have to companies right now who may be swimming in compliance, who may have limited resource to allocate? What are some of those kind of key steps they can take to help give nature a voice within the business and try and get this up the board's agenda?
Yeah, it is a difficult time around compliance. I've got to say, I have a small team. We're running hot, shall I say, and having to apologise to various departments within the business when we're asking them difficult questions. I'm constantly the bearer of bad news, but if you can first identify what you are doing right anyway. What are you already doing right? I mean, and there will be things within the business that actually, if you look at it through a biodiversity lens, that are actually really worth focusing on, and then sort of building out from there. I think we're lucky in a lot of respects that we're doing a lot of things right for a long time because it really is so core to our business. But I think most businesses will have aspects that they're already doing right. I think if you can identify that you're doing enough right, that you can say actually we are able to say that nature is a stakeholder. I think that for our business it was quite an easy change. As soon as I suggested it to the board and to my colleagues on the senior leadership team, there was absolutely, oh yes, of course we do that. So, but actually, if you can get to that point where nature is named as a stakeholder, it's actually quite a powerful statement to make. I think another thing that we've done over the years, I mean, we have forestry management plans on each of our villages and biodiversity targets and the like, but actually we are one of the founder members of the Biodiversity Benchmark, which is a wildlife trusts managed assurance scheme. So that sits just above ISO 14001. So ISO 14001, we run an EMS, an environmental management system, but also we have this sort of additional piece, which is administered by the Wildlife Trust, which is Biodiversity Benchmark. And they audit us each year and check we're doing all the things that we say we're doing. So all of these are additional things, and I know it's difficult, but I mean, this is the direction of travel. So starting to look at what you can pick off that smorgasbord of options is really key. I mean, the other thing is actually just asking your suppliers, because I mean we've found quite a few times now that you've been a bit nervous about asking suppliers questions because you don't know what you're going to find out. Sometimes you don't really want to find out the bad news stories, but actually, you know, if you ask your suppliers what they're doing, you might be sort of happily surprised. I mean, we had a Christmas tree supplier. We were a bit worried that actually, because we put Christmas trees in the lodges at Christmas. We were a bit worried that they were going to give us a terrible story about how unsustainable these things were. But when we dug into it, it turns out that actually cut trees are more sustainable than plastic trees or potted trees, because they for every one cut tree, there's 9 standing trees, because every tree that's cut is 10 years old when it's put to a lodge. So we're actually preserving forests by using cut trees, as long as those forests are not covered in pesticides and herbicides. So when we went and spoke to the supplier, they said, well, yeah, we minimize the use of all of these things. We actually live on the farm, and we've been here for 5 generations, and we've been putting in water sort of courses and lakes and things. And when I sent my biodiversity and ecology manager up there, they saw raptors and orchids. So, but they didn't tell us that because we hadn't asked. And I think sometimes, you know, just asking the questions of your suppliers, whether it's food suppliers or wood suppliers, or you know, we had a similar great story with our one of our timber suppliers. But you know, you sometimes have better stories to tell than you might think.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much. And I think there's a lot to take away from that, and hopefully a lot that other viewers and businesses will be able to consider. And also, you know, fantastic that we came for the nature strategy, and we've also taken away some Christmas strategy as well. So just conscious of time. So thanks very much for taking us through that, Jerome. Please also hang around because we've got a couple of questions coming in. I think a couple of these are towards you. Looks like we've got a bit of a mix. A couple of quick questions on TNFD. Deanna, I'll sort of send these your way first of all. So Deanna, so quick one here, is it compulsory to report under TNFD? And how can TNFD help to achieve climate targets?
Okay, so those are very good questions. So TNFD is voluntary. So it can help to report under compliance, but for now it is voluntary. That means that it is not requiring you to assess your whole operations and value chains. So in fact, it says start small, start where you have quality of data and where you have more information. And then you can, through different iterations in the future, you can start getting more data and more refined as you implement the TNFD framework. So it gives you the freedom for now to just go to a geographical location and maybe it is more material for you, or a product or service, or even a part of your value chain. And the other one is how TNFD can help to achieve climate targets. So TNFD basically gives like a very nice layer over the TCFD. Like keeps very good alignment with the TCFD, keeps the 4 pillars also for reporting. So it helps from the point of view that it gives that or widens the scope. We are not only speaking about climate now, we are speaking about nature, which is a way wider scope. It includes all the impact categories that we were missing before we were living them outside of climate action. In fact, a very good news is that TNFD is going to release a consultation for a discussion paper that they are going to release during the COP16 this year, where they are releasing how to conduct nature scenarios and how you can find synergies and trade-offs with climate scenarios. So I'm very excited to read that report.
Fantastic, thanks very much. One, I think this is probably for Steve, but also for Jerome as well. So when it comes to what can companies be doing, when we start thinking about how can companies make a robust nature positive contribution, what's a good way to go about that?
Maybe I'll jump in, but I'll steal some of Jerome's comments from a little earlier. One of the benefits from these emerging methodologies is that we have far clearer ways to understand the contributions that are being made towards nature. There's an expectation that we'll start to see what these things are, which is it's tangible. It's in our backyards, literally, and we can see the changes of what's happening in nature, and we can measure that, and we can do that over time. When we use a crediting scheme as well, that's bringing in verification and validation. So, if companies were interested in making a nature positive contribution, which we're seeing more and more of, they can do that with a confidence that where they are making those contributions or those investments are trustworthy, that they will be for a long enough period of time that nature can actually, play the course that it needs to over a number of years at a minimum, and then those will be, validated by third parties. And so I think that that's really an important lesson that we've learned as well from the voluntary carbon market. Um, uh, and so I think, as Jerome was saying earlier, there may not be needs to go externally to find those benefits, but rather an approach like this of the B&G, for example, will incentivize property developers, for example, or property owners to actually look internally of where they can change their practices and where they can do things even better than they were before. And that in and of itself is a benefit, just as on the carbon side, reducing emissions is a really important part before one goes out to try and source the carbon credits to offset those impacts.
I think with
Fantastic,
the
thanks.
the offsetting point, it's the same with carbon. If we chop down now and then invest to grow again over 30 years, it's the same as emitting now and buying something that's going to save carbon later. I think it's always better to avoid biodiversity loss in the first instance rather than take a longer time to replace it later. you know
Absolutely.
you can't pay it forward in that easily. But actually, for businesses that are looking to expand or grow or do things which will erode an area of biodiversity, they don't have to wait until then to actually start to invest now in things which are improving biodiversity. You can, certainly in the UK system, you can improve the biodiversity of an area and bank those credits in advance. So actually, credit banking within your own estate in anticipation of future building, is a far more, I would say, ethical and credible way, rather than going to the lender of last resort, which is the central bank of credits, which have you know which then rely on wherever those have come from, those land areas being protected for 30 years, and developed in the way that they've been committed to be developed. But I think for you know you actually, I think out of the UK system, you get a little bit more credit if you proactively protect areas of land on your own estate, as it were, and
Yeah.
commit to development, or to develop the ecology on those areas.
Absolutely. And it's that sort of overlapping subsidies, incentivization that are coming out from government that we're seeing at the moment. It'll be interesting
Mm.
to see how those continue to develop, especially with a slight divergence from what's happening in the EU there as well. I think I was hoping to get one more question in, but just conscious of time, I think we'll probably have to close it there. But thanks so much to all our panelists today. Steve, Deanna, especially Jerome, thanks very much for joining us and for such interesting conversations. And of course, thanks to everyone who has tuned in to join us and pop their questions in the chat. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. We will be sharing the recording of the session shortly. They'll probably be with you in a day or two, and we'll also type up some key takeaways to support that as well. So just as a final thanks to everyone who came along, everyone for participating. And of course, if you would like any further information on the areas that we've discussed, please get in touch with us, or do reach out to Jerome directly. I'm sure you're always up for a chat as well. So thanks, everyone.
Have a look at my LinkedIn for our latest annual report.
Absolutely. nature as a stakeholder is something I think every business can be starting to think about how to be involving that from here. So brilliant, right on time as well. Thanks everyone, have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.